a lot of us have the ability to see something that's not so great and imagine it being much better and more valuable. And that ability usually translates to real estate, so that's why you have HGTV. It's one channel that just sort of indulges that machine within all of us that enjoys looking at like a crappy house and then seeing it become better, seeing it heal. But for some strange reason, very few of us are willing to apply that same muscle that's innate within all of us to businesses. And so when I think about buying businesses of any size, for me, it's, small businesses. I think that there's just such an opportunity because so many people are sort of not seeing what's right in front of their noses.
Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Dude, what time is it? You're in South Korea right now. So just for the listeners or the watchers on YouTube, like what time
almost
is it, man?
Midnight.
It's 10, almost midnight. Respect to you, man. You're a night owl.
This is podcast time.
This is it. All right. This is reserved. This is when you can make time, man. So, well, we're going to hear all about all the things you're working on. And you're doing a lot of different stuff, which is really cool. You're buying companies, coding, teaching people, making music, all this sort of fun stuff. But you're still making time for podcasts, so I appreciate it a lot. Before we get into all of your background, I'd love to hear the story of like what made you land in South Korea. And this was during lockdown, so it wasn't a normal experience.
That's a good question. I'd actually probably go back. I've been asked this question a couple times since moving to South Korea 3 months ago by Korean people. Why did you choose Korea? They're thinking about like other Asian countries. Why don't you just stay in your country? I've been asked that in a nice way, and I had to think about it myself. And I think it actually has to go back to being 10, 11 years old and joining middle school orchestra, and then spending the next 7 years of my life befriending many, many Korean people. And so I think I kind of blame it on that. And, fast forward several years later from, I guess, middle school, high school, I wanted a new challenge. This is like middle of last year. I felt that the stuff I was doing at work, or my quote unquote day job, was like, going well. And you get to this point where you just think, well, I can see the future. If I keep blocking and tackling, if you're in sales, if you just keep picking up the phone, if you're in marketing, if you keep tweaking and doing this and that, if you're in programming, if you keep learning and studying and building and pushing yourself and refactoring and working with better developers, you'll get better. You kind of see that linear growth, that it's bound to happen. But I want exponential growth in my personal life and anything I work on to keep it interesting, because you get a little bit numb to, I think, linear growth and in your personal development or at your company or whatever. So I thought to myself, let's pick up a language. That's something that I know nothing about, second language learning, and then kind of reflecting back on what exposure have I had to foreign languages. Of course, as an American, Spanish, all of us take a couple years of Spanish in high school or college, but I was never really a big fan. And I don't eat carbohydrates really anymore. So like all of the Spanish food, is not going to be friendly. So then I was thinking about Korea.
You're not visiting Italy for sure, man.
Definitely. I spent a month in Italy. Last year I was in Italy for 1 month and I didn't have a single piece of pizza and I didn't have a single plate of pasta. I had like the tomahawk steak like every day, like 1.5 kilogram steak for dinner every day. That was it.
So wait, you're on a carnivore diet or something, right?
Yes. And so Korea is great for that. So like just tonight I went to 2 barbecue restaurants back to back. And then I came here for the show. So, picking a language was like a new challenge. Then I thought, well, I'm a really lucky person. I can go live in that target country. And then a few months ago, I moved here. So I guess nothing crazy, but I do think it kind of starts when I was much younger playing violin. And then it kind of came to full circle as an adult wanting a new challenge and being able to come here and give it a shot.
So, and you're there with your wife? She doesn't have Korean roots, does she?
No. She's also, American. We're both kind of studying together.
Nice.
Well, on our own, but together. Language is Yeah, I guess it's like everything, but you really can't learn it with someone else. Like even if you hire a tutor or go to a school, like you're ultimately learning it on your own. And that's been kind of empowering and maybe disempowering at the same time. Because we like to think that problems can be solved. Like if you have money, you're like, oh, I'll just throw money at my problem. But there's so many things in life, like if you want to be in good shape, like no amount of money gets you in good shape. If you want to have a good body, like you have to put in the same work as everyone else. And so it's kind of maddening. If you want to be a second language speaker, you just have to put in the time, hundreds and thousands of hours to learn the language. And so even though we're kind of trying to do it together, we don't actually study like next to each other because you just have to, everybody's brain works their own way. But yeah, we've both been studying. No reason to be studying it. There's no profit motive. There may never be may never be a profit motive. I'm not going to start a YouTube and talk about
Yeah.
life in Korea or something like that. All respect to people who do it, but yeah, just kind of doing it and seeing where it takes me.
And what I like about that is it's a common thread between all the things you're doing. And kind of what attracted me to what you're working on is, and to clarify, like I reached out to you for an interview, and like nowadays luckily I get a lot of like inbound requests for guests, and like you're a busy guy, so I sent you a message and you said, look, I'm happy to do it. I don't really do that many interviews anymore. It's kind of what I got from your message, but in a polite way. And what I really loved is that you said, I don't want to pitch anything. And, there's so many things you
Mm.
could be pitching, and we'll probably get to talk about some of those things today. But I'm just curious, like, what was that about? Like, I really love that you said that, but I'm just curious, what was your logic behind that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't want to pitch anything. I think most of the time when I speak and it's not to like a room of two people, I'm pitching in some way. If I go to a conference or a podcast or whatever, and I don't think the real me comes through. And I think your show, the vibe is kind of getting to know the person more than just like a press release opportunity. So I figure if I don't pitch anything, who knows what we'll talk about? We'll talk about something I've never talked about before. And having gone on a lot of shows and said some of the same things over and over again, I thought this could be an opportunity that could be really fun for all three of us, you, myself, and the listeners,
Yeah.
to just explore different ideas. And the last time I think I even did this was like 2 years ago. I went on Louis' show, Grenier from Everybody Hates Marketers, the French guy. So I definitely
Mm.
butchered his last name just now. And I've gone on a lot of shows since then. But when I was on his show 2 years ago, we talked about writing in lowercase, and we talked about rules of society, and we talked about all these things that I've never had the opportunity to talk about. And I've gotten a lot of interesting feedback from people since then. So I figured let's make this like another greatest hits. Let's not pitch anything. If you're interested in what I'm up to and want to support what I'm up to, easy to find me. I try to destroy all of the other Ryan Kulps on Google search. But otherwise, we can just shoot it and talk about
Let's
whatever.
kick it, man. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, that's generally the style of the show is we end up focusing on certain topics, but as we kind of discussed before, my approach is usually to turn this into a conversation that's fluid, not just like a question and answer back and forth for 10 questions I've pre-written. And it's just everyone likes different things. That's just the way I learn and how I have fun as well. So we'll try to do that for you listeners today. So yeah, I mean, I guess we've kind of alluded to some of the things you do, but just for people who haven't heard of you or seen any of your work, like how would you describe what your life entails at the moment?
Sure. So I'm 30 years old. I've been in tech and marketing and product and programming, kind of their intersection for my whole career. So really just 8 years. Uh, I grew up in Atlanta, went to school there, moved to New York City immediately after college when I got a new job at a Techstar startup, and then spent a few years bouncing between Techstars and Y Combinator alumni companies who had raised some money, doing marketing, doing support, doing whatever, just learning the ropes, starting a small marketing agency, freelancing. And throughout that process, kind of developed what I think are some somewhat original ideas in terms of how to do marketing from a high level strategic perspective. And then around 26 years old, started learning to code because I was just so frustrated with not being able to see my ideas to fruition. And I was frustrated with developers on my teams kind of disrespecting me, or I felt that they were disrespecting me as a marketer, like, oh, just Ryan giving us dumb stuff to do. And, we have other things we need to work on. And so I started learning to code. And then that journey kind of brought me to where I am today. So now it's been 8 years in the industry, half as a marketer only, a couple as sort of like almost only programming, and now the last one or two trying to find that intersection to be useful to other people, marketing and programming. And it's been really interesting. So like you mentioned, we've been able to develop courses, build new apps, and hopefully, most importantly, just encourage more people at any point in their career in tech who aren't a quote unquote engineer to consider learning to build and seeing how that can unlock new opportunities for themselves.
Yeah, I loved one of your emails recently. You kind of signed it off with, I actually wrote this down, but it was something along the lines of,
I think I remember.
To becoming an owner. I don't know if that's what you were thinking of, but there's lots of things you normally write something unique to sign off. But and again, that just really resonated with me in my own personal journey. To be honest, I think we've got some overlap. Like I also have a background in marketing and digital marketing specifically. I'm not as technical as you. I'm like a 1% technical person, but I've been trying to learn myself as well with your help. And it's just, yeah, beyond actually the type of work we do, I think it's more about the mentality of ownership and choosing what you do. And I've heard you talk about waking up every day and choosing what your day looks like rather than it being dictated by clients or customers or a boss in many ways. And actually, I think a lot of people who listen to the show, I don't have just self-funded or bootstrap people on here. I have VC-backed founders as well, and I'm not like in one camp or the other. I think people should decide what makes most sense for them. But in the last 2 years or so, I've really kind of been veering my way towards the self-funded route because I've spoken to too many people who have said, hey, I've raised $500 million. Nigel Eccles, who was on this show, he built FanDuel, right? So he basically created an industry, but they sold the company for several $100 million and he pretty much made almost nothing. Right. And I don't know the exact numbers, but, and that's happened several times. So to me, that's one big part, not just monetarily, but also the freedom, right? You spent 5-6 years of your life giving up your everything for this company and you leave with almost nothing. That seems kind of like painful to me. So I'm trying to avoid that route. But what about you, man? Because I know you actually worked in venture at one point as well.
That's right on. I mean, well, for starters, I think a lot of us, and maybe people listening, are thinking, how do I answer this question of like, should I raise or not raise? Because you've got really smart people, interesting people, influential people, provocative, prolific people on Twitter. Let's just say Twitter is like representative of the pulse of society. It's really not, but let's just say it is, because for our industry, it kind of is. And you've got 50-50 split or something like that. Like, you've got to raise because then, like, look at all the biggest companies in the world. Like they all raised money, like sometimes a lot of money, because it wouldn't be possible otherwise. And that's sort of the excuse, I guess, or the reasoning. And then there's other people, like let's say Atlassian, like they're a big company. I think they didn't raise any money and they're still growing and all of that. So you're scratching your head as a founder or soon to be founder, or just marketer who's tinkering and thinking one day I want to be a founder. And you don't really know which path to go down. But I put a tweet out the other day that I think tries to answer this question. I've said two things that try to answer this question. The first thing I did was a couple of years ago, I made a YouTube video called How to Deal with Startup Advice. And in the video, I have a whiteboard. So I bought a big whiteboard at my apartment at the time in New York. And I was, once you have a whiteboard, like you use a whiteboard. It's like, you don't know you need a whiteboard until you have one. And then you use it all the time. You're like, whether it's groceries or like whatever. And so I was making these videos and it never really took off. Like these videos got like 87 views and half of them were my mom. But this one video I made was how to deal with startup advice. And what I tried to articulate with a little bit of a depiction and illustration is that all startup advice is true. Because if something exists on one end of the spectrum, like never raise money, don't give anyone equity. So let's say cough, cough, Basecamp. It also is reasonable that the opposite end of the spectrum is also true. So like the PayPal mafia, a dozen people all become billionaires or whatever the metrics ended up being, and they raised a lot of money. So when you're trying to parse advice, you can first determine, like, is this point of view I'm listening to or being influenced by, could it be on a spectrum? And where is it on the spectrum? And all you really want to know for sure, all you really want to try to ascertain is that it's on one of the extreme ends of the spectrum. And if it is, you're good, because we know that both ends of every spectrum are true. Or in like the case of politics, both ends of the spectrum are insane. Both ends of the spectrum are whatever, too cheap, too expensive. And so first look for the spectrum, figure out where the advice is on the spectrum, and then acknowledge that the inverse is kind of also fine. So that's the first thing I thought about with like this eternal debate. Do I raise money or not? Because you can't just make a pros and cons T-chart. That's how a lot of us try to make decisions, and it breaks. Like that strategy for making important decisions breaks with pros and cons T-charts. So the second thing I did was I put out a tweet the other day that said,
could you go into that a little bit? Why does it break?
Because
I
there's
love pros and con charts.
well, let's talk about the pros and cons of pros and cons charts, and then the Zoom meeting will break and we'll be done for the day. There's no restriction. So you can have unlimited pros and unlimited cons. So already you're going to end with an answer that you kind of already had in your head before you started. So like the making of the chart was performance art. It wasn't actually like an analysis that led you anywhere. And even then, let's say you run out. So like 3 hours into my analysis, my pros and cons analysis, I have like 79 on one side and 84 on the other side. Well, now you have to determine like, is 84 better than 79, or 5 of those 84 watered down and they're not as impactful as just one of the 79. Yeah, so the whole thing doesn't really.
It's just equally weighting them, I guess, is the one part of the problem there. And I agree. Right. I would say that when I use, I don't actually do it that often, but when I have, it's normally in my head. And I guess I weight, like if I've got 10 on one side and 7 on the other, the first 3 on the 10 might be the most important. So I think you kind of need almost like a matrix more so, where you rank what is most important to you.
Exactly. It's absent at least one dimension, which is weighting, as well as some kind of constriction. So yeah, if you want to say, where should we go to eat tonight? Give me 3 good reasons we should go to like Mexican versus Italian. That's good, but for really important decisions, I think we have to think about it differently. Maybe not even more deeply. I don't want to say more deeply, just differently. And so the other day I put out a tweet that said, if you're figuring out, like in regards to raising money and not raising money, you should raise money to make your vision bigger, not to make your vision possible. And I think that best encapsulates how I've thought about this over the years, because you see so many people complaining, let's just say what it is, complaining that they can't raise money for whatever reason. And there are some legitimate reasons why people can't raise money. It's not a perfect market. It's not like super like meritocracy and you just like fill out a common app like going to college and all the money, term sheets come your way. Like you have to really hustle. You kind of have to know people who know people. You kind of have to be in certain cities depending on who you're meeting with and who you're trying to raise from. A lot of funds say, we invest in New York businesses, we invest in San Francisco businesses. So I get it. But so many people complain that they can't raise. And I think that the people who do that are often sort of self-selecting themselves out. And the smart venture folks know this, because if you're saying like, I can't start my company because nobody will give me money, the smart venture folks are like, yeah, that's why we didn't give you any money, because you can't start your company unless we give you money. So you're you're telling the world I'm incapable without your help. But it's like, if you're the founder, you have to be the one that can get anything done, regardless of other people giving you permission. So I always thought that was a little bit kind of funny to observe. And so, yeah, raise money to make your vision bigger. And I think the best entrepreneurs who raise money, that's sort of, if you look backwards, that's kind of how it worked out.
I got you, man. I think one thing you alluded to before on the T-chart discussion was kind of this lack of nuance. Like you talked about the far extreme, whether that's politically or all VC is good or all VC is bad. Self-funded is great, self-funded is bad. And I think that's kind of a common thread in society as a whole that we're feeling, and it's definitely pronounced on Twitter and other social platforms, because what normally spreads most are the extremes in many ways. A lot of the time it's outrage or complaining, whatever you want to call it. So I guess, how do we move beyond that? And I guess if you're building a company the way you are, or designing your own kind of life the way you are, like how do you think about staying away from those extremes? Because just to bring one example, like you're eating just meat right now, which to me is an extreme, but it works for you, right? And I'm similar to you. Like I've done very extreme ketogenic diet before, and I'm generally an all in or all out sort of person. So like I am kind of living on the extremes as well in many ways. So it's something I personally kind of struggle with. So I'm just curious, how have you found balance?
Where to begin? I mean, for example, take the meat thing. Um, it's almost like there's no problem with me just eating meat. The problems occur when I tell people that I just eat meat. So it's like a Schrodinger's cat situation. So I've made the mistake of accidentally mentioning to like a vegan at a surf camp last summer in Portugal that,
Yeah.
oh yeah, I'm just eating meat. I think it came up because the surf camp included some of the meals. So you're eating
Mhm.
together kind of communally with other strangers. And she was really upset that I make this decision, and she started lecturing me on statistics regarding the amount of water, right, and different resources it takes to make like a pound of meat versus like some other type of meal. Um, but then I started asking her questions like, well, now it's my turn. And turns out she owns a vehicle. It's like, so she drives a gas car, but I don't have a car. So how do we
Mm.
calculate that? I haven't had a car for like 11 years. You have a car, but I eat more meat than you. How do we calculate that? So there's sort of like a weird tendency to float to the moral high ground in whatever situation we're dealt with, because none of us wants to admit that we're all flawed human beings. But I think maybe one of my superpowers is being willing to admit that I'm a deeply flawed human being, and everything else in life becomes a little bit easier. But some people haven't figured that out yet. So if I tell them that I only eat meat, they then project all of the things that are still unsettled with their own like spirit. And now it's my fault that they have a car and that they actually emit more, you know, more toxins into the atmosphere than I do. So also, women live longer than men. So if you were to calculate the thousands of meals I won't eat that she will eat because I'm going to die sooner, it's really, she's quite the contender to be more mean to the planet than I am. But she's not willing to have that conversation. And a lot of people aren't willing to have that type of conversation, regardless of what you're talking about. So I guess that's one example, but I think it almost reminds me of this current course that I'm working on that you're part of, Founder Hacker, which I don't want to pitch. But the point is, for years, I've gotten to know marketers. And then suddenly I started to code. And then suddenly these marketers that are still my peers are like, wait, what happened to Ryan? Like, how did he suddenly break away from just the marketing to do this other stuff? Did he like go take ayahuasca? Was he lying the whole time? Like, people are kind of wondering, like, did he take some drug, some potion, and now he's able to not just be a marketer? And of course that's false. And that's just sort of like a lack of confidence. And I try to help people with that. But the point is, last year it occurred to me, so many people have asked me, how do you make the jump from marketing to building? So I thought, okay, simple math, algebra, let's make a course. Let's just teach people. Anytime you have that pattern, like people keep asking me to do how to do X, people keep asking me, how do I make such good chocolate cookies? Like, okay, start a recipe site, make a cookie brand. So the same thing happened last year, but I didn't do anything with the idea until a few months ago, a couple months ago. Last month, we launched 30 days ago, not even 30 days ago. And I think that's because I sat on it going, well, there's a million ways to learn how to do programming. Like, what's my shtick? What's my angle? And I wasn't trying to think of it from like a marketer's perspective. What's my product positioning? It was really like, what is the point? What is the point? Because I don't need another job. I don't need another side project. I don't need another email inbox. Now I have all three of those, but I don't need those. So there had to be like a good reason. And I just sat on it. And then this spring, when, the world got kind of crazy, and now there's like people getting canceled. And even if you're not getting canceled, like, you could be perfectly great at your job, but you lose it because your boss is afraid of the pandemic, like shutting down their company. All this chain reaction stuff's happening. It like occurred to me in almost a moment of time. I can't remember exactly where I was, but it was just a month ago. I was like, wait a second, 2 months ago, the whole point here is not that you want to code. It's not that you want to even necessarily be a founder, like a CEO. It's not that you necessarily need to be like paid more money. It's just that you want to own your own destiny. And so that's why what you mentioned, the email signature, the sign off, like, to becoming an owner, because it's not about our ego. Being a CEO is like an ego thing. So I've never called myself a CEO. Ask any of my colleagues, never, ever, ever on any document does it say Ryan Kulp CEO. Other people write Ryan Kulp CEO, like if I go speak somewhere, and I always tell them, say founder, say whatever, say person. But that's like just solving our ego. Being an owner is taking control of your life. So I think it's a very different thing. And being an owner doesn't have anything to do with coding, doesn't have anything to do with like Twitter and having an influence and using like cool tools. Being an owner, it's just about being able to control your life, which is more important than ever because our lives increasingly, if you watch the news, are not in our control. There's so many things that are not in our control. We're becoming very self-aware how little control we have over everything. And so I think now is sort of like, if not now, when? That's kind of the vibe I got this year, and finally decided not to just sit on the idea, finally decided to do something about it, and that became Founder Hacker.
Love that, man. And I saw in your, I think it was your email again, you've had 54 side projects. Is that right? Was that the number? Or something like that?
54.
Like 54.
Those are just the ones that I've linked. There's definitely more. There's some like,
Yeah.
dead sites, but yeah.
And I guess as someone who's listening to this who doesn't really know, I guess we haven't even fully gone into what you do with FOMO and fork equity, which is it sounds like your main thing, or at least what brings in the money. Would you be able to give a sense of scale? Like how many companies do you actually own as part of your fund, and roughly what sort of revenue, profit, whatever you want to share, do you guys do in a year?
Yeah, sure. So we're working on over 6 or 7 projects right now. It's kind of a mix between things we've acquired and things we've built ourselves in-house. We've also, for example, acquired like small add-on competitors. So I wouldn't consider those separate projects. They just kind of get merged with something else. And we've been working on that for 2.5 years, maybe 2.5 to 3 years, Fork Equity. And the idea behind Fork Equity, quite literally the idea behind the name and why we got it started is that it's a vehicle for founders at a fork in the road. And we think that fork in the road is like when you have a successful project that makes $10,000 to $15,000 a month and you're solo, you're doing really well, right? I mean, you're a top 1% of 1% of the planet. You should be really proud of yourself. But if you have some sort of like ideas about scaling and, doubling, tripling, quadrupling your revenue or more, you're going to probably have to hire people. Let's just say you're going to have to hire people. And that's a very scary inflection point to go from like printing money, being a top 1%er, doing it all your own, barely hanging on, to now hiring people and cutting your revenue, your personal income in half or more, only so that maybe if you're lucky, 10 months from now, the new revenue accrued from the new colleagues will like put you right back where you were a year ago. Except now you'll be a year older, you'll be a manager, you won't be a practitioner. So I think that's a really interesting inflection point. I was speaking to someone the other day who agreed and went further and said, there's more inflection points. There's like another inflection point at 30K MRR where you've got 4 colleagues and everything's great, but you make $50 a month. And then you've got like another inflection point where you hit $1 million a year and you're like, what am I doing with my life? Like, should I fire everyone and make $1 million a year, or should I double down again? So there's all these inflection points, and every entrepreneur, every person, once you become an entrepreneur, you discover which inflection points like resonate with you. So like I've blown past some, I didn't realize they happened. And now I'm at one of my own. So that's sort of how we think about it. But yeah, we're working on 6, 7 projects. I'll say, revenue 7 figures, margins around 70%. And lately we've been kind of divesting or considering divesting some of the projects so that we can focus on new things, whether that's more SaaS web apps, whether that's like something totally wild, like buying apartment complexes, whether that's just focusing more on hobbies and language learning for a few months to kind of like get that out of my system. But yeah, that's kind of the scoop. And everyone on the team is remote. There's maybe 9 of us, full-time and part-time, all over the world.
And you work with your wife, right? You're both partners in the same fund, or how's that been for you?
We've been really lucky. I guess I'd pin it on not either of us personally being good at this, or being like relationship gurus or something like that. I mean, I've read like 2 books about relationships, right? 5 love languages, and I think maybe that's it. Maybe I read that twice. So I'm just counting that as 2 books.
Yeah.
But, I think, to be honest, without sounding like I'm being a jerk here, the key to working together with a romantic partner at a company and not losing your mind is that the company just needs to be successful. Like, if the company's making money, like what's the real problem?
Everyone's happy.
Yeah. So it's sort of like in a company, I used to have a boss that always said, he didn't make this up, right? Other people say it, but sales cures all. And, if you have sales, you can figure out your ops issues, you can figure out your personnel and your drama on the team stuff and legal and when your new building's going to be ready, your new office. contracts. But if you don't have sales, like nothing really matters. And so I think the same kind of applies. Like if you're going to go into business with someone you're in a relationship with, just have a good business. And I'm not saying that the relationship needs to be a reflection of the business. I'm not saying you can't have a horribly failing business and still be madly, deeply in love. But when I've talked to other founder friends who went into business with a girlfriend or wife or husband, it does appear that there's a strong correlation between the quality of the relationship and the business. And so maybe the way to architect this is not to start something from scratch that is like, has that 1% chance of succeeding. The way to do it is like one of you should have something that's up and running and already working. And then you bring on the other person to make it bigger and better. And then you've kind of de-risked it to some degree. So that's happened for us. And I tried to validate this anecdotally with a buddy who was in the same situation. He had a company with his wife, but it wasn't going nearly as well as they wanted, causing issues in the relationship. And I asked him, I just said, well, say that your numbers were different. Like, let's say instead of last month, you had this burn and this spend and this negative profit. What if those numbers were upside down and you made that much in profit instead of, losses? Would you still be in the same position? Like telling me this story right now. He said, yeah, probably not. So I think you can go one of two ways. One is to try to create the ephemeral work-life balance with your person and kind of like create really weird rules, like after 5 p.m., never mention the name of this colleague. And maybe some people can figure that out, but I'm not a robot. I wish I was. I really, truly wish I was more of like a machine robot. I could be more productive, but I'd rather just be like a free-flowing person. At 2 a.m., I want to talk about work. At 2 p.m., I want to talk about work. At 3 p.m., I just rather would kind of be more organic. But the key is either to do it that way, separate your concerns, like in code, separation of concerns, or just to have a successful project and then you kind of both win together. So that's the flip side of this, is that you can actually enhance the relationship when you both win together. It feels really good to like schedule a dividend, for example, from one of our projects to our personal bank account. That feels really good. And that's something 99% of couples don't get to experience because they both make their own money in their own ways, their own jobs. But when you get to say like, oh, look at how well we did last month, let's schedule a dividend. That's like a special kind of connection that, very few people get to have.
Yeah, for sure. No, I love that actually. I guess the one question I would have though is, do you have a plan for what would happen if things weren't going as well? So it sounds like things are going well. You've got millions of dollars in revenue. You guys are making a good living. You're doing things you enjoy together. What happens if things like that change? Have you thought that far ahead? Is she listening?
Well,
right
no. We're lucky where, let's say everything fell apart tomorrow, right? We would be able to like chill and take a break for a while and wouldn't have to scramble. I think probably the need to scramble is its own issue. If you're hanging by a thread, you're going to constantly be thinking, what if this doesn't work out next month? What if we don't hit our numbers next month? And then you're not able to think big picture. But we have more, cushion where if everything was destroyed next month, we could still kind of hang out for a while and figure out next plans. But, simple terms, the worst thing that could ever happen would be getting a regular job again. And that's not to insult anyone with regular jobs. Just I've made part of my sort of identity being unemployable. And if I needed to go back on that, I would be disappointed in myself. Again, there's nothing wrong with having a job, but I would just be disappointed in myself and I would feel kind of like I failed to some degree. But that's what's kind of funny. The feeling of failure would come more so from, having a job than making less money, something like that. Because there are people with regular jobs that make more money than, founders, obviously. That happens all the time. That's why, as Taleb says, like the two most addicting things are sugar and a paycheck. So
yeah.
It's really not about the money per se. It's kind of about like what aligns with who you think you are. So failure to me would be not being able to execute on visions, right? And when I did have jobs, I was often not able to execute on my visions or executing on someone else's vision.
So let's go back to that time, if you don't mind. So the time you made that leap and you made a transition, because I think a lot of people listening to this, including myself, when I started this podcast, I had a job and I then changed my job based on meeting the founder through this podcast. And then later down the road, I went full time for the last almost 2 years. And I felt those points where I was like, okay, I'm ready to I used to work at Google, and then I left. I went to charity world, a very different world, right? And not to go in all the details, but you have to think about compensation and what that's going to do for your long-term career and the safety net of basically what I was thinking ahead to a time like this, to be honest, where there was going to be a downturn at some point. And I'll be honest, when I speak to all of my friends at Google, they're really chilling right now, right? And they don't have the same worries that a lot of people do. And especially if you own a business, you're not guaranteed the money every month. And some things can just, there can be a flip that's switched and everything shuts down. Could you take me back to that time where you actually took that leap?
So this brings us back to another one of those spectrum dichotomized kind of questions that a lot of us think about when we're in tech, or like you said, if you're a really great mechanic and you're considering making the leap to owning your own body shop, if you're a really great cook and you're thinking of making the leap to owning a restaurant. And one of the questions that comes up a lot in technology specifically, because the work is so asynchronous and fluid and you kind of just need a laptop to do it, is, when should I quit my day job to pursue my idea? Maybe you already have the idea, maybe the idea is already live, maybe the idea is not yet live, but you're telling yourself that if I just quit tomorrow, I could, have V1 up in a week or two or whatever. And I'd like to think that I'm one of those. I'd like to think that I'm a risk taker. I mean, I guess by definition, I'm a risk taker. The government, the IRS would say I'm a risk taker. But when I look at the indie hackers, and by that I just mean solo creators who have small businesses that are, I guess, paying their bills, a lot of them seem to be much greater risk takers than myself. I see someone on Twitter say, my side project just hit $2,000 a month, so I'm quitting my job today. And I look at that, I'm like, that's crazy. I'm happy for the person. I'm not judging the person. I'm just going, wow, I don't think I could do that. So for example, I was working still full time, great wage and everything, great perks and whatever. I was in San Francisco, 2016 spring. And then I moved back to New York City, and I'm still working full time at this company. Meanwhile, FOMO, one of our projects, portfolio projects, was at like $30,000 or $35,000 a month recurring revenue. But that wasn't enough for me. I was like, no, I got to keep working. This is too small to I can't quit my job. That's way too risky. But then there's other people who are like, I just made my first $50 on my side project. I'm quitting my job tomorrow. So it's hard to gauge who's the bigger risk taker. But another thing that comes to mind is that people quit their job and they say I'm going full time on my idea, and that feels good for a day. And then, maybe a week, maybe a month. And then they start freelancing. So you quit your job so you could focus on your project, but 3 months into it, you're spending 80% of your time on freelance projects, because guess what? You still have the same lifestyle desires. If you're living in New York City or something, your rent didn't change. Your landlord doesn't care. You still probably go to the same restaurants, you go to the same bars. You're not suddenly eating peanut butter and jelly. You're doing whatever you did before. So now you've actually gone the opposite direction of your vision 3 months prior of, let me quit my day job at Google where I get free lunch and go full time on my project. And a week into it, now you're freelancing for Google. So I think that happens a lot. And I think it happens more than people admit it. People put out the tweet that makes them look good. They don't put out the tweet that says hey, here's how I sort of screwed up. So I try to do that. I try to express when I screw up, but I'm guilty of it too. More than 51% of my tweets make me look good. Private conversations are the ones that make me look bad. So there's a performance there that we have to acknowledge, the counterfactual, the again, more Taleb, absence of evidence doesn't mean evidence of absence. And that's really important to think about. But yeah, I was working on and off full time from 2013 through summer 2016. And then since then, for the last, I guess, exactly 4 years and 3 months, I've not had a job. I've just been working on these ventures.
So let's go into that 30K example you said, right? Because I think a lot of people listening to this would say, I'm obviously from the UK, you can probably tell from my accent. A lot of people in the UK make that in a year, right? £30,000, and they live an okay life. They provide for their family. In fact, most of my family growing up didn't make that much more than that. So they might be listening to this and thinking, wow, that's so much money. Why wasn't he feeling comfortable? And I think that's something, first of all, that was revenue. It wasn't profit, and it wasn't taking into account other costs. And and we don't know how much savings you had and what your burn was each month, whether that was a couple grand or $5,000. I don't know what you're happy to share, but just what did you think about in terms of, was there a number you had of number of months runway you had? Like if you had zero money coming in, you could survive for 6 months, or was it a number in the bank that you had of cash savings? I'm just curious how tangible you got there.
So I thought about it a lot, every month since 2016, for each project, I'll create what I call a stakeholder update. That stakeholder update might just be going to me. So I put it in a reverse chronological Google Doc. It's kind of like, here's what happened. Here's how much money we made. Here's some like reflections. It's sort of a journal, personal journal that on some of the projects, a few people receive it. On some of the projects, nobody receives it. And I've done that for 48, 52 months for a few projects. I've got a couple hundred of these updates that I've written since then. And I thought about this like inflection point. When am I going to make the jump? And there are a few things at play. One was that I actually really enjoyed FOMO. At the time, I don't like saying this now, or I don't enjoy admitting this now, but it's the truth. At the time in 2016, when FOMO was 30K MRR and then 32 and then 35 or whatever, I kind of laughed because I told myself, this is a joke that just keeps working. By working, I meant like growing, like people sign up and they like it. And I was kind of like incredulous that I was a part of something that was adding value, because it didn't seem like I deserved it, I guess. Because I had worked on other apps before, started things from scratch, raised money, lost the money, put in a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and those things failed. So I made this fatal flaw of trying to correlate effort and enthusiasm and passion with like the perceived level of success. So whereas FOMO, I tried less hard and it was more successful. And I thought that was like chemically, cosmically wrong. So I called it the joke that just keeps working. So I wasn't really compelled, as one reason, to kind of go full time on like something that I wasn't taking seriously myself. Another thing is that by having a full-time job and FOMO was still maintaining growth, I think it forced me, and it would do this for anyone, it forced me to work on the right things. So if I think about like my day-to-day now, maybe not right now, I'm kind of like more streamlined now, but let's say 6 months ago, 6 months ago, I was still doing 2 a.m. support tickets at FOMO on a Saturday night. Just 6 months ago, maybe 5.5 months ago. I finally kind of stopped doing that and figured out a better way to scale myself. But back in 2016, I could only work a few hours a week on FOMO. So by necessity, I was not doing 2 a.m. support tickets. I was not doing like, I don't know, paying people's invoices and like just all the administrative stuff that founders kind of find themselves doing, taking out the trash, so to speak. So I thought that if I were to quit full time, yeah, maybe it grows faster. But what's winning? Is winning working 5 hours a week and there's 30,000 revenue, or working 45 hours a week and like 37,000 revenue? There's like a marginal return there. So that was reason number 2. And then I think reason number 3, like you said, that was 30,000 revenue, not 30,000 profit. And I think about this one quote all the time. All of us have heard it. Only the paranoid survive. And I don't like to think of myself as a paranoid person, but I think when you're early, in your project, your company, everybody's kind of watching. And there's a lot of sharks out there that are like, hey, he's got this thing going. He's talking about it on Twitter, on podcasts, whatever. It seems to be working. They're evaluating you. They're like, he doesn't seem to be. So they're like, oh, Ryan doesn't seem to be that smart. He's only been coding 4 months. He only works on it 5 hours a week. Like if all this stuff was super, super public back then, maybe we'd have a lot more competitors than we did at the time. And now we have a lot. Now we have 50 competitors. I have 35 of them written down in a spreadsheet. That spreadsheet's name is chopping block. And when they disappear, I strike through their row name. So that's a really satisfying part of my job. But back then there was like no competitors.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is because I didn't put on blast that like this thing is working and it's not taking that much of my time. And so I think those are sort of like the main 3 reasons to not jump ship. But I applaud people who, hit the 1,000 MRR mark and go full time. I think mainly you need to adjust your lifestyle to make it work if you don't have savings. But for me, I've never really been willing to adjust my lifestyle. I've gone and done the Chiang Mai thing and lived really cheaply abroad. And I've done that for short sprints. For short sprints, I think that's great. But for long term, I'm sort of reminded of on Naval's podcast one time, he said, trying to be successful or trying to be productive without any material spoils is playing on hard mode. And I think that's totally right on. And a lot of people think they can do that forever. Like, I'll print money and, live with 7 roommates at a hacker house in South Bay. It's like, well, at some point in time, your brain is going to sort of start screaming at you, like, what is the point of all of my labor if it doesn't get something material in return? And I don't want to say material like clothes, but just whatever that it means to you,
Could be
experience, food, something like
experiences. Yeah, completely. No, I love that, man. And if you don't mind me probing in a little bit more, again, whatever you're happy to share, do you remember like savings, for example? Did you hit a certain savings goal or that monthly runway at all? Or is that not something you were working around?
I don't think that was really on my mind. I'm trying to remember like what my savings were at the time. Not much. No way. Like maybe 3 to 6 months runway. So I don't
Okay.
think that was in my decision. But even on that note, I've for several years kind of internalized this idea that job security is not within whoever you're working for being like a great person or a great company or a company with a great profit margin. Job security is within you and your abilities. And so to me, back then, and as well as now today, 3 months, 6 months, of course I have more than 3 months runway now, very lucky. But back then, let's say I had 3 months, that was okay because I believed in myself that if, I got canned tomorrow and the company failed tomorrow, like I can get out there and hustle. If I have to go back to Chiang Mai, I know which apartment I'm going to live in. I know how much it costs per month. I know like which founders I've been really friendly with over the years that have money and jobs and have raised capital. I know I can hustle and get back in it. And I've actually, I think maybe you've had this thought. I don't want to put any words in your mouth, but I've talked to other founder friends. It's almost like a fantasy. I don't want to call it a fantasy, but I don't know that many words. So it's like a growing fantasy of people who achieve some modicum of success or comfort or something, where you almost dream about like being thrown on the street with nothing and then getting it all back again. Because you realize that the real fun, the thrill was
Yeah.
like the journey, was the ride kind of to the
Yeah, for
mountain and
sure.
not like sitting on the mountain and being bored. And so I think if anything, what was going through my head in 2016, in addition to the things I mentioned, was like, no, I had a few months runway, but I just believed that I could do it all over again. And it's like, hey, world, if you want to challenge me, if you want to put my back up against the wall and tell me my rent's due and I have no money and this, and this, and that's 4 days away, I know I'll figure out a way. It won't be fun. It won't be pretty. I might have to spend some social capital. I might have to swallow some pride. As long as I don't have to ask my parents for help, it's going to be okay. And the more that we can kind of internalize that and believe that, I think the more we can take risks comfortably, safely, and then ultimately, innovate and make things better, faster.
For sure, man. And actually, just studying kind of what you've done throughout your career, I think what's interesting to point out is you've talked a lot about risk, or you've alluded to risk and thinking about being able to take a risk. And again, I think a lot of people think that entrepreneurial people are these huge risk takers, and in many ways, entrepreneurial people are. At the same time, the best entrepreneurs I've studied, at least, or spoken to, really minimize their downside. So I think the way you actually approach this by buying FOMO, and actually I realized we didn't really even say what FOMO does, but it's a Shopify SaaS tool. I think you acquired that business or acquired that project, however you want to define it. And I think that is what attracted me to a lot of your work, because I don't want to say, hey, I'm this big risk taker, I'm able to start everything from scratch and look at what I did. It's more about merging the kind of philosophy of an investor with a builder or creator. And I think that's what your approach has really maximized, which is you're looking at a business, it's got history, it's got existing customers, it's already got some form of product market fit. And you can then say, okay, I find these 3 to 5 things that they're not doing that I could do from day one. And it's a calculated risk is probably the best way to put it. So why don't we, I think I kind of answered the question I was about to ask you, which is why buy versus build from scratch. But is there anything else you want to add to that?
I'd add something I've alluded to one time before, I don't remember where, that a lot of us have the ability to see something that's not so great and imagine it being much better and more valuable. And that ability usually translates to real estate, so that's why you have HGTV. It's one channel that just sort of indulges that machine within all of us that enjoys looking at like a crappy house and then seeing it get, become better. seeing it heal, seeing it get renovated, redone, and sell for more than they bought it for. But for some strange reason, very few of us are willing to apply that same muscle that's innate within all of us to businesses. And so when I think about buying businesses of any size, for me, it's, small businesses. I think that there's just such an opportunity because so many people are sort of not seeing what's right in front of their noses. We're used to seeing you see like a bad pizza place. You're like, your only analysis is that's a bad pizza place, but the right person is like, man, that could be great, because the location is good, or this is good, or the cheese is nice, just not that, or the staff is really good, just not that thing. But we're all able to see it, and we just don't. And so, whereas on the flip side, seemingly everyone says, I want to, or I have, or I am starting a company. So if you just think about the pure numbers here, the competition, do you want to start a company alongside 1 billion people? Or do you want to have this spidey sense that no one's turning on, which says yeah, this place could be so much better than it is. This website, this app, this whatever could be so much better than it is. And again, I think we already all have it. We're just not willing to apply it for whatever reason. That's a separate conversation. But yeah, like you said, what I've been trying to do the last few years and how I've gotten to be known by more than just my parents and friends is saying, look, I'm not some particularly smart or talented person at creating anything. I'm just willing to take, like you said, kind of calculated risks and tweak things. And all of us can tweak. Tweaking is not scary. That doesn't sound very risky, right? That sounds reversible. It sounds like flexible. It sounds like we can multitask. I can tweak, but also work my day job. The other stuff is what's scary, quitting everything and going all in on an idea and, helping our parents refinance their home for seed money. That's some scary stuff, but making tweaks and experimenting is kind of fun. And if you do it enough times, as we know, entrepreneurs, you only have to be right once. So you make hundreds of tweaks. As long as 1 or 2 of them work out, those are pretty good odds. You win.
Yeah, I love that, man. Actually, I guess as we're talking about buying companies and the way you've approached this, there's 2 main thoughts that I think that comes to people's minds right now, which is, where do I get money to buy? And do I need to have $1 million in the bank to be able to buy, which rules out 99.9% of people, which we're going to come to in a second to show you don't need to do that the same way you don't need $1 million to buy a house for $1 million. And then the second thing is, I don't have the skill set. Or you're talking about SaaS and code and all this sort of stuff. I don't know how to code. Where do I start? So maybe we can go into both of those now around, you obviously had to think this through and say, okay, I might not have all the money in the world to buy FOMO, which I think was your first acquisition. And what are people not understanding about that process? So I just gave that example of a home. 99% of people understand you get a mortgage to buy a home. But when you buy a SaaS tool, an online business, or even an offline business, which has been going on for decades or maybe even longer, you most of the time aren't buying straight up in cash, because that's not normally the best way to do that. So how did you make your first acquisition and get around that creatively?
Yeah. Well, of course, it bears mentioning. But so like you said, my first acquisition, I didn't put any money down. So it didn't actually matter whether I had money or not. I'll spill the beans. I didn't have any money, right? Like I said, I had a few months runway. I was living in San Francisco in a studio apartment that was $3,600 a month. I had no money, but I had some skills. So I think that's almost the first thing worth talking about. You mentioned the 2 things, well, how do I do this? I don't have skills. How do I do this? I don't have money. It's well, they kind of go together, because if you don't have skills, it doesn't even matter if you have money, because you're gonna screw it up. Look at how many trust fund kids try to start a liquor brand or something, and then it doesn't work out. So I would actually value the skills over the money, because the money part is sort of you can get creative. You can use your skills to create the money. That's the whole point. You can't really use your money to create skills, which we talked about earlier with language learning, getting fit, whatever. You cannot just throw money at these problems. You cannot give someone money and then knowledge lands in your brain. Elon Musk is trying to make that happen, but until then, you have to just sit down and stare. You have to stare at a piece of paper with words on it, or you have to stare at a screen with words on it. That is how all knowledge is transferred, staring at something with words on it. I'm sorry, So, and the good news is you don't need any money to do that transaction, to transfer any amount of any cross section of the world's knowledge from other people's brains into your brains, you don't need any money. Sometimes you do it because it's more efficient. Like I'd rather take a programming course by one person than watch 37 YouTube videos, but you can do the latter. You can watch the 37 YouTube videos. So I'd start there. If you don't have the skills, don't worry about not having the money, because if you did have the money, you're going to screw it up anyway. And I don't want to say that to be fatalist. I just mean to say, think about this as a process, the marathon,
so
not sprint.
Start with skills, whether that's being able to grow, find deals, partner with other people, or be a coder and someone who can actually build themselves.
Of course. I mean, I used to, I'm 13 years old. I think to myself, it's kind of a long story, but I decided I wanted to learn to play guitar through this like experience I had when I was 12 or 13. I get a guitar. Fast forward 10 years. I was playing now guitar for 10 years, like as a hobbyist musician. I performed a lot and whatever, but that was it. Never was like my job. Fast forward 10 years, I'm living in New York City. I want more money because I want to pay rent and go to bars. And I had a full-time job, but I go on Craigslist and I post guitar lessons for executives. That was my title. And the post content was a photo of me performing at a show. So I was trying to convey like, this is going to be you, right? So I was putting my marketing hat on, and it said something like forget scales, forget this. We learn on your time. We learn your favorite songs. So I was trying to be the opposite of every other teacher who is like, we start with the fundamentals and music theory, because I know how that is. And it's really boring because that's how I learned violin, was that classical way. So I put this up, immediately start getting pinged. And I start teaching like hedge fund managers how to play guitar and their Upper East Side loft apartments. So the point is like, it started with the skill, me being a 13-year-old kid that I guess wanted to impress 13-year-old girls, right? 10 years later, it turned into money kind of effortlessly. So it really starts with the skills. But let's say you have some skills, and now your question is the other thing you asked, which is like, I'm a good marketer, I'm a developer, blah, blah, blah. But for XYZ reasons, I don't have $1 million. It's like, well, okay, that's 99.9999% of the world. That's fine. You're fine. You're in the same club as everybody else. That's where you have to realize you have to be creative. So that's kind of its own skill. No matter what it is that you do for like your day job, having like an edge of creativity becomes a force multiplier for whatever it is you're trying to do, particularly in financial transactions. So our first acquisition, FOMO, which was called Notify at the time, we didn't put any money down, so I'll certainly say I had a lot of luck, but there's ways to increase your luck. So as you kind of like see where this is going, it's like first just develop skills, then combine the skills, that becomes explosive, add an edge of creativity, which is the force multiplier, and then increase your luck surface area. Suddenly you go from being like no money, so I had no money, to a 3 months runway to you have a company that makes $1 million. Of course, there's all kinds of things that happen in the middle, but it's not impossible. And that's what I try to communicate to people. That's what I try to teach people.
So, and just to be more specific with FOMO in particular, again, I know some of this is private information, but like, could you give a sense of how much the acquisition was and how much? Oh, yeah. First of all, let's start with that. I think you've mentioned it before on some other. I think Nathan Latka was trying to get numbers out of you like he does. So yeah, I think, even a range, like, so people get a sense of how much the acquisition was.
The acquisition was 6 figures. Yeah,
okay.
The valuation. I would be willing to talk about it, but we have an agreement with the original founder not to talk about it. So I probably got the most juice I've ever given out was on the Latka show that you mentioned. But
he's got a skill for that, yeah.
Yeah, he does.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So 6 figures. So it's between 100,000 to $1 million, let's say somewhere in between that. And you said it was making 33K revenue at the time, or 30K revenue at the time. And so people have an understanding per month that was. So
when we bought it, it was making 15,000 a month.
15. Revenue. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So
fast forward a few months, we had doubled it in maybe 4 months.
Wow. So, and again, someone listening to this can do the numbers on a calculator on their phone, but just to give a sense for people, from my understanding, the way valuations normally work for these sorts of companies are either a multiple of revenue or a multiple of profit, right? In SaaS, I think it's closer to like 5x revenue is the number that is your yearly revenue in this case. And with other bootstrap, and this is of a certain size. If you go into public markets and billions of dollar companies, the multiples are different. But my understanding is 5x yearly revenue is around the number you'd be happy to pay, from what I've heard you say. And then on the other side, if you're buying something that's fairly small, like a content website or something like that, you might be paying 2 to 3x yearly profit. Is that about right?
Something like that, and some of it too is like, if you buy a content site, you're dependent on Google. If you buy a SaaS website, ostensibly at least, it feels like you're dependent on just blocking and tackling, doing good customer service, building a good product. Whereas Google can destroy you overnight. A bunch of SaaS competitors really can't destroy you overnight. It's a long road to build something great and convince other people. Look at Coca-Cola and Pepsi. Like, this thing's never going to end. Neither one of them will, in my opinion, will ever win. Even the government won't allow it, right? Antitrust laws will prevent one of them from winning. They're both going to keep winning. But if your website, as many news websites have found out in the last year, and Google decides to demonetize your YouTube channel or to shut off comments or whatever, you're dead overnight. So that's also why the multiples are different, because the risk profile is higher. With SaaS, I would say that one of the main drivers in the valuation, whether the multiple is 2 or 3 or 7 or whatever, is what type of buyer it is. And it doesn't just mean like if the buyer has a lot of money or if they're Google or if they're not Google. It really means what their intention is behind buying you. And that intention can be described as either strategic or financial. A financial buyer needs to fit your numbers into their spreadsheet model that they've kind of pledged to their investors is like how they make money for the investors. And that means they give you like exact multiples. They explain everything. It's very clear. Whereas a strategic buyer is sort of like, they might see something you don't see. So Google buys, what was it called? Like DoubleClick, right? Which became Google AdWords, which became their whole business. They saw something that maybe even DoubleClick didn't see. Of course, that was a huge acquisition, like $1 billion, $2 billion or something. But even then, that you could argue today that was undervalued. YouTube, same thing. They bought it for $1 billion. Today, it's worth whatever. So strategic doesn't really think about it in terms of multiples. They think about it in terms of like, what could it be in the near or far,
how
far,
it would
far, far
grow
future.
your other assets or something that already exists, I guess.
That's right. It could become a force multiplier. So like maybe the original seller can never achieve the vision that you could achieve with their product if you were able to merge it with your existing resources and infrastructure. So I think as an entrepreneur, you kind of want to be, when you think about, I want to exit, I want to get acquired, you want to be acquired by a strategic buyer. It doesn't mean you need to be acquired by Google because they have a lot of cash. It just means you want to be acquired by someone who's not going to be as rational to just put a multiplier on your numbers. They're going to think much, much bigger. And once they think bigger, you win bigger too.
Yeah, for sure. And I actually think that's a great example with Google or Facebook. Let's say Facebook with Instagram, when they bought, was it Instagram was $1 billion? I think it was $1 billion. And at the time, people would say, wow, like you're paying $1 billion for something that doesn't make any money at all. And obviously now that's one of the best acquisitions of all time for Facebook, right? There are hundreds of billions of dollars of a company, maybe 600 billion the market cap is now, something like that. So I guess let's go into that section a little bit more. And I know this is a little bit dense for some people, but I think I'd love to give people a few tangible examples. So with FOMO, I think you use something called seller side financing, or which could you explain what that is for people that have never heard of that?
Seller side financing. So of course, financing, like if you get a car or house, you're getting the money from a third party and then paying it over time to the seller. Seller side financing is sort of like saying the seller is giving me the money to pay the seller. You say, well, how does that work? Well, what it means is that you're basically just going to pay the seller out of revenues that haven't yet occurred. So if the company makes $10,000 a month, regardless of whatever the valuation is and all of that, you may essentially work it out such that you pay the seller $8,000 a month. And that could be a really good deal for them because maybe up until yesterday, until they sold it to you, they were working full time on it, making $8,000 a month. Tomorrow, they continue making $8,000 a month and don't work full time on it. So that's sort of how seller side financing works. And then the way you can sweeten it and make it, I think, align the incentives and the risks further, because what the seller could say is, well, what if you screw me? What if the business goes under? What we established when we bought Notify was a clawback provision And the way that worked is that if we were to not make a payment, I think it was 2 months in a row, the seller would get the entire business back. So now they've made, again, in our theoretical makes $10,000 a month, we pay them 8. They would have collected all those $8,000 paychecks, not done any work. And now month 30, let's say, we stopped paying them because we've screwed something up, we've overspent, we've been negligent. They get the whole business back. So now they've made $240,000 for no work. They own the business again. And with any luck, the business or the product is better than it was 3 years ago without any effort on their part. So that's kind of a really aggressive way that you can, I don't want to say persuade, like this isn't about manipulation or mind games, but that's a good way you can align interests with a nervous seller, to let them know, like, hey, you win no matter what. You win no matter what.
Love that. And we'll come on to 2 other examples in a second with the debt equity sort of split. But just since you mentioned it, I think one of the biggest questions I've heard from people is, why is someone selling an asset like this in the first place, right? Like if it's making you 10, 20, 50 grand a month and it's so valuable that someone else wants to buy it from you, why is that person selling it in the first place? And, sometimes it's the fact that someone's had enough and they want to move on, they want to get their time back, or they want to focus on their core business, which are great reasons to buy something if it's authentically the reason. But I'm sure many of the people that come now proactively to you to sell are people that you need to filter through due diligence. And they might say it's because they want to focus on their core business. But what we actually find, even when I've been looking at this world, is there something under the hood you didn't realize? Like you said, if it's a content site, Google just hit them with a penalty. Or if it's an e-commerce site, e-commerce business, there's some legal thing that you didn't know is happening. They're getting sued or anything like that. So how do you normally differentiate between those sorts of people, and how have you made mistakes in that world where you thought you did as much due diligence as you needed and it messed up?
I don't recall us making mistakes. So far the deals we've done, there's been no surprises. Just one deal, one time, the revenue was a little different during diligence. So we changed the valuation commensurate with that. So not like as a punishment, just took the same multiple, everything, reduced it a little bit. That's the closest we've come to a mistake. And that was definitely an honest accident. But this is another one of those examples. Both things are true. So some people will sell and they give fake reasons for selling, and you have to really parse through that. And that judgment takes, I don't want to say it takes years because that discourages someone from making their first deal. When I made my first deal, I didn't have years of judgment. Right now I only have like 4. So a lot of people would look at that and laugh and say, you have none. But that judgment isn't something that can kind of be like taught. It has to be learned, if that makes sense. But the other thing that's also true is sometimes people really do have a really great asset and they want to get out of it. And it's hard to believe it because it kind of has that like scent of like, it looks too good to be true, therefore it is too good to be true. And I think the cynic takes that idea. If it looks too good to be true, it is too good to be true. And they live their whole life and that becomes like their mantra. And then they don't achieve or they experience things they could experience because they've chosen that one mental model, that one lens through which to look at everything, to evaluate everything. But the truth is, once you're on the other side of the table, once or twice or 3 times, you realize that, actually, sometimes everything is really amazing and you just want it to go away. And I don't know if it's like the self-destructive nature of some of us to like just blow things up.
So could you say that again?
Really
everything is great, but you want it all to go away. What do you mean by that?
So let's say, like, for example, a tiny, stupid example, really tiny, stupid example. Just a couple of days ago, I put a tweet out that I have 8 Chrome extensions. Collectively, they have like a few thousand users, right? They're all just free extensions, built them each in like an afternoon over the last couple of years. And I got some email notices from Google Chrome Web Store that I need to make some small updates to keep them listed on the App Store. And that would really not be a problem. But I looked at it and I just thought, I don't care. I'm totally apathetic. I don't care. These are just going to go away. And so I thought this was kind of funny, like observing my own sentiment towards this. Like, why am I being so fatalist? This isn't my personality, but I still find myself just not caring at all that these 8 Chrome extensions that have hundreds of users are going to disappear very soon. So I tweeted out, I have these extensions, they're going to disappear and I don't care. Then what happens? A few people reply to my tweet. Are you selling them? Can I buy them? Guess what? I didn't reply to any tweets. I'm not selling them. I don't care. I care so little. I care negative zero that I'm not only going to let them die, I'm not even going to take free money that trusted followers would give me in exchange for me like logging into the web store and saying transfer owner to. Like that would be so effortless, but I'm not even going to do it. So you can look at this and say like, well, Ryan, you're just crazy irrational. It's like, okay, that's true. Now multiply that and realize there are thousands and millions of other people with projects much bigger than my Chrome extensions that have the exact same sentiment. So I can't explain it. It doesn't make sense, but there are people with $1 million businesses, and I know some of them. I've talked to one of them. Business makes like $1.5 million revenue. Profits very high, let's say like 800,000. And he told me he would happily sell the business for 1 million. And this is SaaS. So it's like, well, if that was my business, I would want at least 3x or something like that. He's happy to sell for 1x. So if you're that buyer that wants to have that singular mental model, it looks too good to be true, therefore it must be. Well, guess what? You would miss out on the opportunity with this particular founder. But that's because his psyche is in a different place. You're trying to think logic. You're trying to shove everything through this like logical plug, and that person's not being logical. So if you can find those opportunities, and I'm not saying the person we bought Notify from wasn't being logical. I'm just saying the right time and the right place. That's like another lens that kind of competes with or sits adjacent to if it looks good to be true, it is too good to be true. If you can be willing to look through these optionalities or opportunities with different lenses, yeah, you can find that. You can find a killer business at a great multiple. The seller is honest. There's no ulterior motive. And you walk away with a really great opportunity. It can happen, but you have to believe it first, or else everything is going to like look like a duck, quack like a duck, and be a duck.
Yeah, I love that, man. I think that really resonates with me because I find there's two types of people that I often speak to, whether that's friends or people on the podcast. Though I think the people on the podcast normally skew to the optimistic sort of person who tries to see the good in a situation, because normally founders or people who are building things have to kind of be like that in most ways. So let's just say you've got a business idea or you've got a business you're about to buy and you share that with 10 people. I find there's two types of people. The first is see the worst in every situation. And again, I'm definitely putting two extremes in this case. There's nuance, but just to simplify, there's the person who's like, oh, well, why would that person sell? And oh, they're trying to find everything wrong with it, right? And I find often those people, even though you need those people in a company often to give some balance, to be the main person who's actually taking that on, to buying a company, starting a company, that person often, I think, focuses on the wrong thing, and they talk themselves out of starting it in the first place, or they talk themselves out of the opportunity. And I think a lot of people who are early in their kind of entrepreneurial lives, they share those ideas with their family, for example, is a great example, because family, especially parents, most of the time are people who want the best for you, and they want you to take the safe route. Yeah, exactly. So obviously that depends how lucky you are with parents, the DNA of parents. But you know, I can just speak for myself. My parents, I think, genuinely want the best for me, but they've got a mental model of the world that is very different to mine, and that comes from their experience. They came to the UK as immigrants. They were very poor, and they had to find some stability to pay for a family of 3 kids. So that makes complete sense, rational sense. But then if we talk about certain ideas, they obviously shouldn't and wouldn't think the same way I do. And that makes complete sense. But what I find peculiar is when I speak to my friends who often are the most comfortable, I'm stopping myself from saying the word privilege because it has a lot of political connotations, but you kind of get what I'm saying, of the people who are, people who are chilling, doing great. They often are sometimes the most negative, I find, in terms of, you know, finding the worst in a situation. And then there's the second type of person who I think I try to share ideas with, the people who are like, oh, what about this? You didn't think about this part, and it kind of snowballs. And again, that's not just because I want positive feedback. It's because there's stifling energy and there's energy that pushes you forward. And I think, especially in the early stages, you need that kind of snowball forward versus the other way around. I don't know. Do you feel the same, or you might have an opposing view to that?
I agree. And I think the struggle or the trick is to just learn to, I adopted this phrase from an old co-founder of mine, Dave. and we would listen to feedback from clients. So we had an agency together. And of course, you got to make your clients happy. But anyone that's ever worked at an agency, especially if you do creative work, has learned that sometimes you're better for the client than the client is, like for their own goal. You know, that like that's why they hired you, right? You can bring in some special sauce they aren't seeing. And so he would say after the meetings, like, well, let's just take that feedback and throw it in the trash. And when you visualize the inputs of other people, and like, I think a lot of us, we like to say, oh, I didn't like what he said at that meeting, but I like what he said. We think we're like parsing it correctly, like just letting the good feedback influence us. But unless you're really conscious about it, taking the negative feedback and throwing in the trash, you're not throwing in the trash. It's going to influence your future decisions and thoughts and whatever. It's going to nag at you. Maybe even years later, you're still going to think about that person that told you you can't do XYZ at your high school science fair. You have to really go, I'm taking it and I'm throwing it in the trash. And one thing that a lot of these people have in common who say you can't do this and here's why, they're not entrepreneurs. Or if they are, they're not successful entrepreneurs. So when you're trying to think about like, what do I want to be when I grow up? But I still think about that a lot. Sorry, I'm needing to burp again. By the way, this is my beverage. I didn't introduce it before. It's called Poor Man's Sangria.
What's in it, man?
Yeah. So still burping. So it's red wine and tonic water. And if you're lucky, I'm not lucky today in Seoul, Korea. If you're lucky, a pinch of cinnamon. That kind of gives it the class and it convinces your brain that it's actually fresh cut fruit. Yeah. It's a Poor Man's Sangria.
Love that.
But you know, these people who have this kind of feedback, they have one thing in common. Like they're not ahead of you. And so you have to be intentional, like what is it that you want, and realize that sometimes they're just projecting, you know, they want to be like you, or they want to be a founder, but they didn't take that leap for XYZ reasons. And there's nothing wrong with that. Again, there's nothing wrong with that, but you have to take their feedback and throw it in the, throw it in the trash.
All right. So let's wrap this section up. We've talked quite in detail about buying, why you buy, how you buy, beyond just having to put money up front. There are two areas that I think people don't often think about with buying companies, and hopefully we can share this with the community we're both in together that you've set up, which are people who buy companies and help each other. And one of the areas I find interesting, people just completely ignore, is debt, right? So if you think of traditional private equity or essentially any sort of finance, there's normally debt and there's equity. If you've got a company, that's how you fund it, often is one of those two buckets. So in terms of equity, that normally means giving a part away to someone who wants to take a risk, and they have a percentage of the company, whether that's an investor or something like that. And in debt is where you will say, okay, I'm going to get a mortgage and it's a debt from the bank, and then I have to pay them a percentage every month. But when we talk about buying companies specifically, there are very specific services out there that help you with this, right? So why don't we start with debt? So I know you've mentioned in the past, I think there's like PayPal, Working Capital, Lending Club. There's a bunch of these services out there. And if anyone's interested, you can ping me or Ryan on Twitter. I'll put it on the screen right now so you can ping us and we can share a few of those resources with you. But one of the interesting ones, especially in the US, are called SBA loans, right? The Small Business Administration. And could you explain what they are and why they can be a great tool for people?
So I've not personally done an SBA loan, but I've come close before, and we've got some lectures, like you mentioned, in our course about it from people who help administer SBA loans, who are more knowledgeable than me. But an SBA loan is when the Small Business Administration, SBA, they sort of partner up with banks. So banks that are private otherwise can get SBA approved, or they can get SBA like certified, and that gives them the authority to lend you, the entrepreneur, some amount of money to buy or expand a business. And what that means is that the bank gives you money from their private capital, and they give you better terms than one of these online services, because the government, Uncle Sam, has decided that, hey, as long as you and the bank check these XYZ boxes, they will kind of back the loan and help the bank out if you screw up. So this is kind of similar to, like, not the same thing, but sort of similar to like FHA loan, first time homeowners. You can put down 5% instead of a 20% down payment. And all of these things, once you're talking about taking out debt and minimizing your upfront capital, it could be very risky. It could be dangerous. Of course, you have to be careful. But the benefit is it allows for the more free exchange of assets, or the more free transfer of assets. So if you have some great business, let's imagine you're in like, I don't want to pick on one country for being like not as rich, but let's just say, yeah, I really don't want to say any country, but let's
We get
invent
it.
a country,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, let's just invent a country called Moscow. Okay.
Yeah.
It's not the real
Okay.
Moscow,
Yeah. Yeah.
but you're in Moscow and you have this like badass e-commerce store that makes $10 million a year or something. And you personally make $3 million a year. And you're the richest person in the entire country, like the entire country. And the next richest person are like your employees in the whole country. But you want to sell your business because you just want to go like surfing. It's like, well, without the right mechanisms in place, you're stuck because no one in your country can buy your company from you because you're the biggest company. And so I think some of these mechanisms are trying, in my opinion, what they achieve, whether this is their stated purpose or not, is they make that matter, like matter is not created or destroyed, it's only transferred. They make matters such as businesses and assets more transferable. So now you don't have to limit your buyers to like someone in this other fictional country that's bigger than you, someone else who just has good ideas and a good attitude and a smart head on their shoulders. You can transfer the asset to them. You win, they win, and everybody wins. So that's kind of how I see it. Similar to like secondary markets, which everybody has like tried to start and failed at. You know, like if I want to buy a share of Uber before Uber went public, right? That's a secondary market. And it's really, really difficult to do that. But when we figure out how to scale these kinds of projects, everything moves so much more fluidly. You know, you can own a little bit of anything at any time. So SBA loans allow your target addressable market as a seller to be much, much larger. Now, someone who just knows, who has subject matter expertise in whatever it is that you do, they become a contender to buy your company, even though they may not independently be wealthy. But when you go through the SBA loan process, you have to submit a lot of paperwork. Can't say it's not worth it. You know, if you have $50,000 and through SBA you can buy like a $1 million business, that's worth the paperwork, right? So I'm not discouraging anyone, but you submit business plans, you submit financials. The business that's selling as well also submits all kinds of information. The bank kind of does the diligence on that on your and their behalf, because the bank has to answer to the government and say that, hey, you know, we checked all the boxes for you. And then the bank loans you the money. And then in addition to this, your rate, your interest rate is going to be a lot better than some of these other services. So that's one of the main differences with getting a loan for a home. You know, let's say you get a 4% mortgage or something nowadays. But if you want to get a loan for your SaaS business, even if it's really successful and makes money and blah, 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 they're going to give you like 11% or 17%.
But it's higher risk,
22%.
Right? It's less predictable to a certain extent.
They say it. I don't know. To me, a recurring SaaS business that's been around
That's
5
true.
years is
Yeah.
lower risk than like a first-time
That's fair, yeah.
homeowner. But you know, the banks kind of calculate that a home has intrinsic value because it's sitting on a piece of land, and land is one of the only finite resources we have on the planet. Everything else we can create more of, or it doesn't exist in 5 years. It becomes obsolete. SaaS software, how do you give intrinsic value to like text files? You can't really give intrinsic value. You can't assign it. So that's why you get much better rates for basically single digit for things connected to land and double digit rates for things that are in the cloud. But SBA tries to bridge that gap, and you can get, you know, single digit interest rates for software, which again increases the transferability of all the assets out there.
Yeah, that's great. And how do you think that's changed now we're now in the coronavirus pandemic? We have been this now, what was the date today? We're coming towards the end of July when we're recording this. So, you know, we've been in this pandemic. There's been a lot of issues financially to the economy, obviously. Do you have any sense of how that's changing the ability to be able to get these funds from the SBA or other lenders? And I think the SBA are the same people who are working on, what is it called? The PPP loans, I think, might be related to this as well. So there's all these loans out there right now for businesses to survive, which is probably a great thing for people who are really struggling with it. Do you think that means the overall pool of funds are drying up for these sorts of loans that could be used to acquire a company?
Well, firstly, I'm not smart enough to answer this question, and nor
I
do I
like that
have enough
answer, by the
data.
way. Most
Nor
people
do I
should
have
do
the
that more
data.
often. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Well, anecdotally, you know, we're getting lots of deal flow, whether it's automated, inbound, outbound. We're looking at lots of opportunities all the time. And anecdotally, the valuation multiples and the number of deals and the amount of money is as good, if not better, than pre-pandemic times. And there's a lot of interesting theories online why that is. Basically, people think it's like, I forgot the technical term, but essentially like sleeper money, right? Like the money was already there, and now the sharks are coming out and saying like, this is that recession that Warren Buffett has always been talking about, right? Like this is my opportunity that he had in the 70s and the 90s and all these different periods in time where the market was down, and thinking about his quote of like, be greedy when others are whatever, and be this when others are greedy. I forgot the word. But that's kind of, I think, how a lot of people are perceiving the current pandemic. And so while conceptually or intuitively, everyone should be holding their purses tight to their chest, and I think a lot of consumers are, the slightly more rational funds or people that manage, that have access to funds, they're actually kind of taking the different approach, and they're trying to do roll-ups and consolidate and all kinds of things. Because I'm seeing through brokerages and so forth, like I was seeing, 3.2x multiple for SaaS businesses on average, let's say for a few months, and that's like 100 deals. And now I'm seeing 4 and 5x during a pandemic. So I actually think there's more demand. I don't know if there's more supply. Hard to generalize the psyche of someone who has a successful business in the middle of a pandemic. Are you thinking, I got to get rid of it because it's hot potato and it's going to fail tomorrow? Or are you thinking, I just need to survive the storm and then I'll be better than ever? I can't really speak to that, but I do think the demand is higher than ever. There is a lot of capital that was just kind of sitting around, and people are looking at this and going, hey, wait, this is my 2008 opportunity. If you missed out on buying homes in 2008, this is my whatever, insert other recession year opportunity because you weren't around for that one. I think the demand's higher than ever. I'm not sure how that reflects to the actual volume of loans or anything like that related to SBA, but if the demand's higher than ever, I imagine there's more applications than ever as well.
Yeah, that's great. I'm feeling the same. I feel like a lot of people I know who traditionally might have invested in real estate or public markets, asking me like, what else are you investing in? And I've always found this to be a really interesting area, because if you look at it on an actual return basis, the returns here are incredible, right? If you get it right. And they're, compared to real estate and the stock market, they're fairly predictable. Whereas right now with the stock market, especially, we're kind of it feels like we're in a Bitcoin bubble. The way we were in 2017, everything's going up still when everything's messed up and the economy is screwed. And for some reason we're at record highs again. I don't fully get
Everything's burning. It's not even just messed up. The world is literally burning, and my stocks are doing better than ever. It makes no sense.
It makes no sense. So and I think the quote you were referencing, if I can get it right, from Warren Buffett was, be fearful when others are greedy and greedy when others are fearful, I think. And I do like that quote, though I do. And I like Warren Buffett a lot, but I try to take everything he says with a grain of salt, because he's a big mastermind who's run stuff for a long time, and I feel like he has a lot of secrets that we don't really get access to in how he actually runs his business. But I think that's actually a great quote, because when everyone, let's just say Bitcoin and crypto in 2017, everyone started getting greedy, including myself, to be honest. And everyone is like, oh, this can only go up, right? And it makes no sense. People didn't even understand what cryptocurrencies were most of the time, and they were investing in it. And even though in the long run, maybe things pick up again, but that's the time where you need to start to be a little bit careful, because people start making irrational decisions. And it comes back to something you mentioned before, which was finding the inefficiencies. I think that's what Warren Buffett, and his partner have focused on over the years, which is, we're going to look at all the numbers. We're going to get a sense of a company's profile, profitability, future chances of success. And we're going to see where they're undervalued, and that's the basis of value investing, I guess. And I like, we can apply some of those principles to what you're doing as well, because you can say the market is not completely efficient. I remember like studying once upon a time in like finance class, there's like this efficiency hypothesis of the market. Like especially in the public market, right? Like, okay, we announced that airlines are going to be closed, so therefore the price should already be reflective of that, because it's a really liquid market. But we can see that isn't necessarily the case. And again, we probably need 2 hours just to go into that one particular point, so we can skip that for now. But I do think that's a great way to think through things, where when something is hyped up, often you need to be wary and say, okay, this isn't necessarily where I want to focus my efforts. At the same time, there's sometimes a lot of heat for a reason. Like SaaS companies, software as a service, is really hot right now. Recurring revenue is hot. Micro private equity is becoming fairly hot in certain circles. So that doesn't mean it's all bad, but I think people need to think independently where they can. So just to close that off, I'd love to hear, an example of partnering with investors, because you have a fund, Fork Equity, and you partner. I think you have investors that are involved with that too, right?
Yes. So we sort of have I don't want to use any buzzwords. I'd say it's a decentralized, but I really just want to say a newsletter community of hundreds of investors that we ping on a per deal basis to say, hey, do you want to get involved? Here's sort of like how much we're looking to fill. But otherwise we use our own money or debt or whatever to get these deals done. But yeah, so instead of raising like a fund up front, which we've sort of come close to doing, we just kind of do this like on-demand investment model, which is maybe a little more headache for us, but I think that the investors prefer it.
I like it. So just to clarify, if there was $1 million business you're trying to acquire, from my understanding, you probably still, even if you're going to the SBA or getting debt from somewhere else, you probably still need 10 to 20% minimum, ideally in cash, whether that's coming from an investor or your own pocket. Is that roughly the ratio you'd be looking at?
For something like that, 10 or 20%, we would be happy to do it ourselves with our own funds. But even maybe 2 years ago, we wouldn't have, we wouldn't have been able to or wouldn't have wanted to. At this point, I would say kind of bringing in investors is more to try to get more people with the same aligned incentives. So if you have an investor that's like knows a ton about X vertical, yeah, I want him to invest alongside us, even if we don't need their capital, because they can make introductions or be helpful in some way. Now, I wouldn't say this about like the average venture capital firm, because it's become a meme that they are trying to be helpful. They're not helpful, they just give you the money. But I think when it comes to angel investors, when your angel investors are fellow founders or builders or developers, not just guys with Patagonia vests on, they actually can be very, very helpful, and it could bode well to, I don't want to say take, but to accept outside investment, even if you don't need it, because it allows you to think a little more clearly when you're less personally on the line. Enough on the line that you have skin in the game, but not so much on the line that you're worried that like if you make the wrong marketing campaign decision on Facebook tomorrow, you're not going to be able to feed your family the next month. So you have to find that balance. But also when you bring in the outsiders, they kind of become free employees. So that's what some people don't understand. But when you're an angel investor and you get monthly or weekly updates from your founder, you can't help but try to be helpful, and you're not billing them for that time. So when you are that founder or the entrepreneur buying the company, and you are lucky enough to know 10 rich people, let's say, who have skills, that are adjacent to what you're looking to buy, take some of their money, just take a little bit, even if you don't need it, because you've just hired 10 free interns that are very, very smart.
The last thing is you've got 6-7 projects going on at once. Often people are at this stage are looking to hire staff, or even mini CEOs or heads of each company. I think Andrew Wilkinson, who has Tiny Capital, who does a similar sort of work, his approach is very much like very hands off. They're not as involved. They look for someone to run things from day one, it looks like. What's your approach been, and how do you staff up on the portfolio of investments?
Our approach is very different. If there's one thing I've learned, and I'd like to think I've learned at least one thing, it's that companies, I don't even care to call them companies, just call them projects or products, products that make money. Your products go through these life cycles where they need a lot of care and love, and then they don't really need any, particularly SaaS. And that's kind of the point, like inherent to building an app. No one wakes up from a dream to like spend 70 hours a week fixing bugs on their SaaS forever. We get excited because you can work really hard over the weekend, launch an MVP on Hacker News, then quickly fix some bugs and hot fixes, and then spend a couple weeks adding bare minimum features to reduce churn and fix the leaky bucket. And then you have a few months to coast and think about what's the next step? Where do you want to take this product? That's where it gets really exciting in software, is the scalability and the diminishing requirement of your time to create maximized outcomes. And so similarly, if you have a company, a product, and you have this fixed team, 3 engineers, 2 this, 1 designer, 1 marketer. The fact of the matter is some months they're going to need to work a lot harder than other months. And those months where they work harder and you have a higher burn rate aren't necessarily going to be the months that you make more money. And so we experienced that, like at FOMO, we experienced that at other projects. Some of our best months were where we had the fewest commits to the master branch. Some of our worst months were where we shipped more product than ever. And we had more newsletters or more marketing or more ad spend or more whatever. There's not a direct correlation because we're all trying to figure it out as we go. And so what we do at Fork that's very different from some of the others you mentioned is we have one centralized team and we kind of rent them out. We build them out to each of the products on a per product basis. So one of our apps, labaloo.com, it serves florists. It's an invoicing tool. It's a very, very niche app. And we decided a few months ago, we should refresh the interface, the logged in interface. We should do a new landing page. So what we did was we staffed like 5 people from the Fork team to work on this, to do new branding, to do new everything, new emails, like mailer templates, like everything inside and out. And they worked really hard. It was like a 3, 4, 5 week sprint. Labaloo's burn became like 10x what it usually is that month. And then the next month it was back to like near zero. So we've been able to, I think, be more lean. And then on
it
a
sounds
per
like
project,
more like shared resources almost. Like you've got designers and developers and marketers who can work across many companies at once, and they understand your ethos and philosophy. So you kind of have the Fork equity stamp across all of them. Is that accurate?
That's exactly right. Right. So like you said, there's an ethos, and even logistically, like for example, all of our apps are built in Ruby on Rails. So yeah, context switching is a problem with development. You don't want to like switch from app to app every 30 minutes, but you could switch app to app like once or twice a day. You can work on one project in the morning and one in the afternoon. That's not a big deal. Once you go to lunch, you've kind of context switched anyway. So whatever you come back to, it's not a big deal. So just by having them all in the same tech stack from a nuts and bolts perspective is really helpful to scale them. And like you said, the Fork team is basically like a marketing agency, and they serve each client. And the good news is for the team, their structure is just, hey, just work during the regular day and you get paid the same rate. It doesn't really matter what you worked on. So they're not worried about like, nobody gets paid hourly. Nobody has to think about like, how do I justify my existence 9 to 5? There's always a million things to do. Just switch over from project A to project B to project C throughout the week. And then at the end of the week, there's a simple way to say, I spent 2 days on this, 1 day on that. It's a very, very kind of like simple system, no time trackers or whatever. But every project on a per project basis has a much better P&L than just like, well, we hired 8 people at this company. We have to try to keep them busy all the time, because keeping them busy does not directly correlate with like the company being more successful that month.
Love it, man. Thanks so much for going into all the nuts and bolts. I know we've been going on for some time, and this is definitely more in depth than I've seen most people speak about this topic. So I think hopefully it should be very helpful for people who are interested in this world. Just to close out, what's a question that you wish people asked but they don't? And I'd love for you to answer that now. Or is there a topic you never really get to talk about and you feel like it gets neglected?
That's an easy one. Second question is easier than the first one. The thing that's neglected that I never talk about is being conservative and being in the tech industry. And kind of fascinating to me that it's not just like 50-50 like other industries, but everything's weird these days. So it's like, okay, teachers aren't 50-50 male, female. We could talk about that, the why forever. But it's very interesting to me that like in technology or entrepreneurship, you have a lot of people that have a certain group of values, like capitalism and that kind of thing, but also, I guess, vote for people that are very against those values. So we see a lot of people sort of like, especially on Twitter, acting one way, but actually thinking a different way, because one way makes you look good and keeps like your investors happy. But then one way actually is how you like steward your family and your personal finances. So my story has been, well, not my story, but my approach has been, because I'm sort of a bootstrapper guy, I'm not beholden to anyone. So I have this like unique opportunity to just be the same person all of the time. And I think so many people are used to like having 2 personas. Like, one, here's how I do Twitter. Here's how I talk to my friends at the bar. Here's how I run my company. But I'm able to sort of just be the same person. And all that comes down to just being like conservative in tech. And somehow that's become part of my it's become part of my online brand instead of just like one of my sets of opinions. Like, oh, I like, I don't like olives, but I like cream cheese. Instead of it being something as simple as that, it's like, what's wrong with you? So that's something that we never talk about, but I think it's kind of interesting.
Just to wrap things up, a couple quick ones for you. On a scale from 1 to 10, how lucky do you think you are?
10 out of 10. And it's funny because I constantly say to myself, or I say to my wife, that I feel unlucky when something unfortunate happens. But then I try to ground myself later and realize that I'm just incredibly lucky and I don't deserve it. And when I started to realize this was a couple of years ago, like out loud to myself, that I felt that I was too lucky and didn't deserve it. I actually felt bad, like actually genuinely bad. And then I think that I thought that there was some honor or nobility to that. And a lot of people go through this, some kind of like guilt for having some modicum of success. And then I realized that's its own form of like deep, deep, weird arrogance and judgment over other people. Like, I think I'm too good. No, none of that's true. It's simply, what can you do? Like, what do you do with the cards you're dealt? So trying to find ways to find more purpose in life and give back in different ways. It doesn't just mean money. It's just like, how can you help people and how can you help people at scale? So like, because I'm in tech literally means scale of some type of help. So that's what I'm trying to do nowadays. So 10 out of 10 luck. That luck comes in many forms, as other people have talked about. There's like the deterministic luck, and there's the blind luck and all of that. I think I have more and less of each one. I think I have very little blind luck, right? I've never won a drawing or contest or anything like that. But I have other types of luck that I'm, super grateful for. And so what I try to do is help other people increase their luck too.
I love that. Yeah, no, I think that's a great point around different types of luck. And I haven't actually asked this exact question before, but I think the word luck is again quite triggering to some people, and and I get why, because I think the word luck often implies in a simplistic way, people think luck means it's something completely out of my control. And I think the nuanced view is there are different types of luck, and there's luck where you literally were born in a place with certain type of parents, with a certain amount of money, you went to a certain school. Most of those things are completely out of your hands. And then there's other luck, which is maybe, that you have a little bit more control over, like the luck of finding a great deal, the luck of making a sale. Those are two types of luck that you can increase your chances by speaking to more prospects, to doing more outreach, doing proactive work. And yeah, so I think that's another topic for another day as well. But I love your answer, and there is no right or wrong answer, but just curious on your view. And then just to close things off, man, thanks again for all of this. If
Sure.
money was no obstacle, what would you be trying to build?
Oh, I would just be in a band. Yeah,
Mm.
I would tour in a band. So that was my old life, my past life. I thought I was going to be a rock star. I took a year off after high school instead of going to college. I eventually went to school, but yeah, I thought I was going to like tour in a van with my buddies and be a musician. Didn't care at all about money. So I'd like to think that if I could not do it again, I don't have regrets, but if in the structure of your question were true, didn't care at all or didn't need it, yeah, I would just go back to that. My only innate skill is playing music, like guitar. And actually my best skill is playing violin, and it's completely useless nowadays. So if I could go back or have an alternative reality, that's what I would do.
I love that, man. And actually, just on that, what stopped you from doing that right now? Because it sounds like you're doing pretty well
Yeah,
financially. You probably getting to a point where if you wanted to, you could probably let the recurring revenue come in, hire someone to do the things that you're doing. Is there anything stopping
without
you?
realizing it, I think without realizing it, you just asked me the best, most hardcore, tough love, accountability question that anyone's asked me in like 3 years. Why aren't you just doing that right now? Couldn't you just figure
Mm.
it out and do that right now? Couldn't you just like let things run? And you're right. So last year I recorded in 4 different studios in 4 different countries while I was traveling the world, but none of the songs were any good. So my goal was like, this year I'm going to write one good song. I wrote like 7 or 8, recorded them all. None of them are any good. One's like, okay, it's like a 6 out of 10 or something on the Ryan scale, not a 6 out of 10 on the Billboard charts. So I'm still figuring it out. I'm reminded of the Ira Glass clip about like, if you're in art and creative, you just have to keep going until your output matches the taste that you already have. And once it does, you'll know it, because like your tastes are actually really high, but what you keep creating is like way below what your tastes are demanding. So I just need to keep going. Right. So that is potentially, I haven't really announced it, I guess, but kind of on my mind for the very near future, is shifting a lot more of my time back to music and creating. But yeah, without you realizing it, you just gave me the most existential question I've been asked in the last couple of years.
That's amazing. I'm glad to play that role, man. And yeah, that's a great way to end. I think we've touched on so many things. If you're still listening to this, thank you for hanging around. I think we've probably gone 2 hours or so, and I don't know if we're even going to cut much out. I think this was really fluid conversation, touches on so many things. And I just want to thank you again for obviously making time such at a late time, but also for what you're doing, man. I think you're really empowering people like myself and others who have the will to learn new skills and take ownership as much as we can. And I love that your answer said 10 out of 10 on luck scale. I feel completely the same. And a lot of people listening to this should feel the same as well, I think. You know, if you've got an iPhone in your pocket, you're already better off than a lot of the world. If you speak English, you're in a better position to be able to learn from the free resources of the internet. That doesn't take away all the issues we all have to deal with. And I think we're all trying to achieve the same thing. So again, thanks a lot, man. I really appreciate time, and looking forward to keeping in touch.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers, brother.